Tonight, when you step into a warm shower, you'll wash away the day without a second thought. You'll lather up with soap, rinse off, and feel clean. It's a basic, unremarkable ritual of modern life. But if you were to step into a time machine and travel back to Europe just 400 years ago, you would discover a world where that simple act was considered not just bizarre, but flat out suicidal. If you walked through the streets of Paris or London in the 1600s, the first thing that would hit you wouldn't be the sights. It would be the smell. A thick, suffocating wall of human body odor, rotting garbage, and untreated waste hanging heavy in the air. But here is the most shocking part. The people living in that stench didn't think they were dirty. In fact, by the standards of their time, they were meticulously clean. Our modern concept of hygiene, the idea that water cleanses the skin and keeps us healthy, is a completely accidental, incredibly recent invention. For centuries, the wealthiest, most powerful people on Earth deliberately avoided water. They believed with absolute certainty that bathing opened your skin up to deadly plagues. They didn't wash their bodies. They washed their shirts. So how did humanity spend generations terrified of a bath? And what suddenly flipped the switch to make us obsessed with daily showers? The answer takes us inside a world where water was a weapon, linen was a shield, and our ancestors fought a quiet, microscopic war against the air they breathed. To understand how we got here, we have to look at what happened when the Roman Empire collapsed. The Romans, famously, loved water. They built massive public baths, sophisticated aqueducts, and intricate sewage systems. Bathing was a social cornerstone. But when the empire fell, that infrastructure crumbled, and the knowledge of how to maintain it vanished. Yet, early medieval Europeans still bathed. They had public bathhouses, washed regularly in rivers, and associated water with cleanliness. Then, in 1347, the world ended. The Black Death swept across Europe, wiping out upwards of 60% of the population. It was a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. Cities were decimated, families wiped out in days. And because nobody understood germ theory, the greatest medical minds of the era scrambled to find a cause. The medical faculty at the University of Paris, the most prestigious scientific body of the time, issued an official verdict. The plague, they claimed, was caused by miasma, corrupt, poisoned air that carried disease directly into the body. But how did this poisoned air get inside you? The doctors looked at the human body and focused on the pores, the tiny openings in your skin. They argued that when you immerse yourself in hot water, your body warms up and your pores open wide. In a healthy environment, that might be fine. But in a world filled with plague and foul air, open pores were an open invitation. The miasma would flood into your dilated pores, settle deep into your vital organs, and rot you from the inside out. Almost overnight, the medical consensus flipped. Water wasn't a cleanser, it was a danger. Bathing didn't make you healthy, it left you completely defenseless. By the 1500s and 1600s, this theory had hardened into absolute cultural dogma. Public bathhouses were permanently shuttered, not just because they were seen as hubs for spreading diseases like syphilis, but because the very act of sitting in hot water was viewed as a biological gamble. Doctors actively warned against washing your face with water, claiming it caused toothaches, ruined the eyesight, and made people pale. If you absolutely had to clean your hands or face, you used a dry linen cloth, or perhaps a little bit of wine or vinegar on a rag. Water was strictly kept away from the skin. This created a massive logistical problem. If you aren't washing your body, you are going to smell, and your skin is going to accumulate grease, sweat, and dead cells. But European society still had a strict social hierarchy, and the elite needed a way to prove they were superior and clean without ever touching a drop of water. The solution they invented was linen. During the muddy century, the definition of a clean person had nothing to do with their skin. It had everything to do with their underwear. Specifically, a crisp white shirt made of flax linen, worn directly against the body beneath heavy wool or silk outer garments. The theory was beautifully simple. Linen was believed to have a natural magnetic quality that actively drew sweat, dirt, and impurities out of the skin. It functioned like a dry sponge, absorbing the body's internal toxins, so the skin didn't have to be opened by water. Therefore, if you wore a fresh white linen shirt every day, your body was being continuously laundered. Because linen was expensive to buy and incredibly labor-intensive to wash, it became the ultimate status symbol. The wealthier you were, the more often you changed your shirt. King Louis XIV of France, who famously ruled from the opulent Palace of Versailles, reportedly changed his white linen shirt up to 3 or 4 times a day. He almost never took a full bath in his entire adult life. Legend says he took only 2 or 3 and hated them entirely. Yet, he was considered the cleanest, most refined man in Europe because his linen cuffs and collars were always blindingly white. At Versailles, this created a bizarre sensory contrast. The palace was a masterpiece of gold, mirrors, and fine art, but it had no plumbing. Courtiers relieved themselves in hallways, behind curtains, and in courtyards. The aristocratic elite, dripping in diamonds and silks, reeked of stale sweat and unwashed skin. To combat the stench, they didn't wash. They heavily smothered themselves in perfumes, powders, and scented oils. Cleanliness was an optical illusion, measured by the whiteness of your collar and the strength of your perfume. For ordinary peasants who couldn't afford dozens of linen shirts, the reality was much grimmer. They wore the same coarse garments for months, sharing their layers with fleas, lice, and bacteria. Skin diseases, rashes, and persistent infections were just a standard part of being alive. Because everyone smelled, nobody really noticed the baseline odor, but the physical toll on human health was massive. This dry-wiping, water-fearing lifestyle lasted for well over 2 centuries. But by the late 1700s, the gears of history began to shift. The Enlightenment brought a new wave of scientific curiosity, and doctors began questioning the old miasma theories. They noticed that people who accidentally fell into water or worked in damp environments weren't instantly dropping dead of plagues. In fact, fresh air and cool water seemed to invigorate the body. The real revolution, however, came with the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. As millions of people migrated from rural farms into tightly packed factory cities, the sheer volume of humanity created an unprecedented health crisis. Cholera and typhus ripped through urban slums. The stench of these crowded cities was so overwhelming that the old miasma theory made a massive comeback, but this time with a practical twist. Sanitarians argued that if foul odors caused disease, then the only way to save the cities was to physically clean them up. Governments began investing heavily in massive public engineering projects, building modern sewer systems, cleaning up rivers, and piping clean water directly into urban centers. Simultaneously, the manufacturing of soap transitioned from a crude, harsh backyard chore into a highly industrialized, mass-market science. Suddenly, clean water and cheap soap were widely available. But changing a deeply ingrained cultural fear of water required a massive psychological shift. Enter the marketing engine of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Soap manufacturers and public health advocates realized they needed to rewrite the definition of what it meant to be a civilized human being. They launched aggressive advertising campaigns that completely inverted the old rules. They didn't just sell soap, they sold shame. Advertisements began targeting working-class families, telling them that body odor was a sign of moral decay, poverty, and social failure. School curricula were rewritten to include mandatory hygiene lessons, teaching children that washing their hands and faces daily was a patriotic duty. By the time germ theory was fully proven and accepted by science, the cultural war had already been won. Water was no longer the enemy that opened the door to death. It was the primary shield that washed the microscopic killers away. Within a few generations, humanity went from a species that viewed a bath as a medical emergency to a society that feels uncomfortable if we miss a single morning shower. We built entire architectural rooms, bathrooms, dedicated solely to the luxury of running water, an experience that would have terrified King Louis XIV. When we look back at the muddy century, it is easy to laugh at our ancestors, to view them as ignorant or backwards. But their behavior wasn't stupid. It was completely logical based on the information they had. In a world without microscopes, where a mysterious illness could kill half your town in a week, avoiding the thing that seemed to open your body up to the environment was a survival strategy. They built an entire system of fashion, etiquette, and status around protecting themselves from what they genuinely believed was a lethal threat. We traded our linen shields and heavily perfumed collars for a bar of soap and a shower head, completely forgetting how fragile that transition actually was. We conquered our fear of water, flooded our daily lives with it, and completely erased the centuries when staying clean meant staying completely dry.